Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about a piece of paper you have probably signed without reading. It has a boring name. It is called a general power of attorney, and it is 1 page long, and it gives another human being the legal right to be you, to sign your name, to sell what you own, to move your money and your mail and your parents' medicine. Every year, tens of thousands of families sign one because somebody is deploying or somebody is getting old, and a helpful person at a folding table says, "We can take care of all of this for you while you're gone." Most of the time, that helpful person really is helpful. Sometimes he is a predator who has learned that the fastest way to rob a family is not to break a window. It is to be handed the keys, on paper, with a smile and a notary stamp, by people who are exhausted and scared and grateful for the help. Today's story is about a man who was 11,000 kilometers away when somebody with a clipboard emptied his life, killed his father, and then called him to laugh about it. What that man did next is the reason I wanted to tell you this one. He did not do the thing you are expecting. He did something colder, slower, and about 1,000 times worse for the people who earned it. Stay with me for the whole thing, because the last 5 minutes change how you will look at every kind stranger who ever offered to handle your paperwork. The airfield at Ballad never really got dark. There was always something burning off in the distance or lifting off behind the berm, and the light came up under the clouds in a dirty orange the men in Quinton Kirkendall's cell had stopped seeing years ago. He was 41 years old, a sergeant major with 19 years in, and he lived in a plywood room behind a door with no name on it, in a compound that officially did not exist inside a base that officially did. What he actually did for a living was find people. His cell was 11 men and 1 civilian analyst, and their entire purpose was to take a network of human beings who did not want to be found and take it apart from the outside in. They did not start with the man at the top. They started with the driver who bought the same brand of cigarettes at the same shop, with the cousin who used a phone twice and threw it away, with the receipt in a pocket, with a scrap of paper listing 4 numbers in a woman's handwriting. Quint's teams called it working the seam. Every network, no matter how careful, had a seam, because networks are made of people, and people are lazy in patterns. Find the pattern, pull the thread, and the whole thing came apart in your hands in about 6 weeks. He had a wall for it, butcher paper and grease pencil, phone number boxed and connected, photographs with strings of yarn, dates, times, a running tally in the corner. His analyst, a 29-year-old from Ohio named Bexley Nevins, whom everybody called Bex, had 3 graduate degrees and a coffee habit that frightened medics, and she used to say the wall was Quint's real personality. He drew everything. He could not think unless he was drawing. It came from his father. Back home in Grayling, in Ledbury County, North Carolina, there was a barn with a slate blackboard nailed to the inside of the door, and on that board, Gilbert Kirkendall had chalked the weather, the feed, the truck's mileage, and the day's mail route for 34 years. Gib Kirkendall carried Route 4, 91 miles of gravel and 2-lane, 206 boxes, and he knew every one of them the way a doctor knows a pulse. He knew which widow put her flag up only when her son wrote. He knew that the Tillery place got seed catalogs in January and nothing else all year. He knew which box meant somebody was sick, because the medicine came in a padded envelope with a return address in Tennessee. When Quint was a boy, his father used to bring him along in the right seat of the Jeep and quiz him. "Whose box is that? What's different about it today?" Gib would say, "Son, anybody can see a thing. The trick is noticing when a thing stops." And when Quint got recruited out of a line battalion into selection, and then into a unit he was not allowed to describe at Thanksgiving, and his whole adult profession turned out to be noticing when things stopped, he never once told his father that he had simply grown up to do the mail route on a bigger map. He told his family he worked movement control. Trucks, pallets, manifests. It was a boring, plausible, easily forgotten answer, and for 19 years it had done its job. His wife, Charmaine, believed it for about the first 8 years, stopped asking around year 10, and by the time their daughter Linnea was born, she had built a whole private story out of it. Other women's husbands came home from work. Hers came home from being a warehouse clerk in a war, looking like something had been sanded off him, saying nothing, sleeping badly, then leaving again for 8 months. Char had married a man from Grayling and gotten a man who lived in a plywood room with no name on the door, and she had never gotten a single detail she could tell her mother at church. Linny was 9 that year. She had her grandfather's stubborn chin and a serious way of holding a pencil, and she had a little brass wind-up clock beside her bed that Gib had given her, a chime clock, the kind that hits a soft double note on the half hour. Quint had been home for 11 weeks of her 9th year. He knew that number exactly. He knew a lot of numbers exactly, and that one lived somewhere he did not go on purpose. 2 weeks before it all came apart, his father left him a voicemail. The connection through the morale line was terrible, and Gib talked over the delay, the way old men do. "Son, it's your dad. Listen, there's something going on out here with the mail. Some of these old boys on my route, their statements quit coming. Not 1, not 2, 9 so far that I can count, all of them with kids overseas. I got it all wrote down, but I don't want to say it on a telephone. Call me when you get 5 minutes, all right? Not 5 minutes of the army's. 5 of yours." Quint listened to it standing outside the operations tent at 0400 with a target package under his arm and 40 minutes until a launch. And he thought, that's Dad being Dad. And he thought, I'll call him Sunday. And then Sunday came and there was a man in Diala who had to be found before he moved again, and Quint did not call. He would spend the next 2 years of his life learning exactly what those 9 names were worth, and how much a man will pay for 11 weeks of a 9-year-old's life, and what it costs to be a person who finds people for a living and did not, for once in his life, look at the pattern in his own hand. The Red Cross message came in on a Tuesday. Gib Kirkendall had been a diabetic for 22 years and had never once let it be interesting. He ran his numbers in a spiral notebook. He ate the same breakfast, and he had never in 2 decades been admitted for anything worse than a bad tooth. On the 11th of the month, his neighbor found the porch light burning at noon and Gib on the kitchen floor beside a chair he had pulled over, dead since sometime the night before. The county coroner in Ledbury was a part-time funeral director who signed 41 death certificates a year, and he wrote diabetic ketoacidosis, natural, no autopsy. 71 years old, widower, lived alone. Nothing about it made anybody in that county pick up a pen twice. Nothing except one detail that would take Quint 4 months to find, and when he found it, it would end 4 lives and rebuild 40. The house Gib died in had been his father's. It sat on 81 acres of sandy loam off Sardis Road, and it had been paid off since 1994, and there was a slate board in the barn with his last route chalked on it in his blocky capitals, unfinished, because he had gotten to the letter D, and then something had interrupted him. Grayling had 1,100 people, a Dollar General, 2 churches, a volunteer fire department, and the Ogilvie Memorial Chapel, which had buried everybody in Ledbury County for 3 generations. Garth Ogilvie was 63, silver, soft-voiced, and beloved. He sponsored the high school baseball team. He kept a box of tissues in his hand at graveside like a waiter with a towel. He had also, over 11 years, built the quietest and most profitable machine in that half of the state. And the machine ran on a simple observation. When a family is frightened and busy, they will sign anything a kind man puts in front of them, and they will thank him for the pen. The machine's front man had arrived in Grayling 4 years earlier, driving a clean gray truck with a magnetic sign on the door, Home Front Family Services. He was 38, built like somebody who had played ball at a small college, and he had a way of standing at the edge of a room until you invited him in. He said his name was Simeon Vestry. He said everybody called him Sim. He rented a storefront next to the insurance office, hung a flag in the window, and a framed photograph of a soldier hugging a little girl at an airport, and he went to work the way a good salesman does, which is to say, he made himself useful for free for 18 months. He drove old men to dialysis. He fixed the church van. He sat with the VFW post on Thursday nights and let the veterans talk over him. He learned who was deploying out of Bragg, which was 90 minutes south, and whose mother was alone, and whose father had land and no will. And then he set up a folding table in the fellowship hall at Ledbury Baptist, with a coffee urn and a stack of forms, and he called it the Deployment Readiness Day. Free notary. Free help with your paperwork while your soldier is gone. 9 families signed that first year. By the 4th year it was 34. What the family signed, without exception, was a general power of attorney. Not the limited kind a legal assistance officer on post will write for you. The kind that says, "This person may register one vehicle in my name between these two dates." The general kind. 1 page. It says, "This person may do anything I could do." Alongside it, Sim had them fill out a second form, and this was the piece nobody ever remembered signing, because it was the most boring paper on the table. A change of mail forwarding, temporary, 12 months, to a post office box in the next county over. He would explain it in a warm, reasonable voice while he refilled your coffee. You don't want statements piling up in a mailbox on a country road while your boy's overseas. That's how identity theft happens. We'll hold everything, we'll pay what's due, and you'll get a clean folder when he comes home. He was not lying about the folder. Every family got one, quarterly, with tidy printed summaries in it. The summaries were fiction. The statements themselves went to the box. With the mail gone and the signature in hand, the rest was patient carpentry. An equity line quietly opened against a paid-off farm, a refinance, a vehicle title moved, and at the far end, the part that made Garth Ogilvy's operation different from a common thief. The money did not sit in a bank where a subpoena could find it. It went into prepaid funeral trusts at Ogilvy Memorial, dozens of them, in the names of people who were old or dead or made up, because a funeral trust is a strange, sleepy little legal animal that nobody audits and nobody stares at, and Garth Ogilvy was its trustee. They took, on average, $61,000 from a family, and the family usually did not notice for 11 months. When they did notice, they were told there had been a bank error, and Sim would sit in their kitchen and be furious on their behalf, and promise to fix it, and about a third of the time, he actually gave a little back, which bought another year of silence. Twice in 11 years, an old person had gotten stubborn. Both times, the old person had a documented medical condition, and a home health aide, and a very sad, very ordinary death. The aide's name was Ginny Rasmussen. She had a license, a caseload, and a gambling problem in Cherokee that Garth Ogilvy had been quietly paying down since 2003. Charmaine Kirkendall was not on anybody's list. She walked into it the way people walk into most disasters, which is sideways and out of loneliness. She met Sim at the deployment readiness day in the fellowship hall, where he was very kind to her and did not once ask what her husband did. That was the trick that got her. Everybody in Grayling asked her what Quint did, and she had to say movement control and watch their faces do the small polite thing they did. Sim said, "That's got to be a hard way to be married," and she cried in a church kitchen in front of a stranger, and that was the whole seduction. It took him 4 months to get to the rest of it, and he was in no hurry, because she was not the prize. The 81 acres on Sardis Road were the prize, and the old man on them was the obstacle, and Charmaine was the door. By spring she had signed a general power of attorney of her own, and had let Sim take over what she called the money stress. By summer, he was at the house when Linny got off the school bus. By fall, Rodney Dunmeyer, Charmaine's older brother, who had worked the teller line and then the loan desk at the branch in Ledbury for 16 years and had never once been the interesting one in his family, was signing off on documents he did not read for a man who took him fishing and called him a partner. Floyd and Bonita Dunmeyer, Charmaine's parents, thought Sim was the best thing that had happened to their daughter. He mowed their yard. He put a ramp on their porch for Floyd's knee. When Char started talking about how Quint had abandoned them, they nodded along, because it was easier than the truth, which was that their daughter had gotten bored and then gotten caught, and was now building a story where she was the one who had been wronged. Gib Kirkendall never bought a minute of it. He was polite about it for about a year, in the way of a man who has decided to watch. He had met 1,000 people at the mouths of their driveways. He said, "That fella is standing wrong." Nobody knew what he meant. What he meant was that Sim Vestry stood the way men stand when they are counting the exits. And then the mail told him. Gib had been retired 6 years, but a rural carrier does not stop being a rural carrier. He filled in on Route 4 9 or 10 days a year when the regular carrier took leave, and on those days he did what he had always done, which was pay attention. In April he ran the route and Norbert Tillery's box, which for 40 years had held a seed catalog, a pension statement, and a letter from his granddaughter, held nothing but a grocery flyer. In June, he ran it again, and it was the same. Lachlan Ulmer's box, same. The Prentice place, same. Every one of them a household with somebody deployed or an old person alone, and every one of them dead quiet. So Gib did what his son would have done, though neither of them ever got to appreciate the symmetry. He got a notebook. It was a carrier's notebook, the same kind he had used since 1974, a narrow spiral thing with a stiff cover that fits in a shirt pocket. He wrote down names and box numbers. He wrote down the date each one went quiet. He went to the post office in Ledbury and, because he had trained half the clerks in that building, he was allowed to look at the change of address orders, and he copied down the forwarding addresses, and every one of them went to the same P.O. box in the next county. He wrote down the box number. He wrote down the dates the orders were filed. He noticed something a stranger would not have noticed, which was that 11 of the 31 orders had been filed on days when the family swore they had not been to the post office at all. Then he did the thing that killed him. He drove to the storefront in Grayling, walked in on a Tuesday afternoon, and put the notebook on the desk in front of Sim Vestry, closed, with his hand on it, and said, "I want you to tell me why 31 people on my route have their mail going to a box in Sardis you rent." He did not tell anyone he was going to do that. He was 71, and he had carried mail through 2 hurricanes, and he did not believe in being afraid of a man in a golf shirt. Sim was very calm. He said there had to be an explanation, and he'd look into it, and he walked Gib to the door with a hand on his shoulder, and he watched the truck pull out, and then he called Garth Ogilvy, who listened for 90 seconds and said one sentence, "Handle it soft, and handle it this week." On the 9th, Ginny Rasmussen made a call on Gib Kirkendall on the pretext of a wellness check for the county, which she had done twice before that year. On the 10th, Gib's insulin pen did not work. He tried 3. He was a careful man. He kept a spare box in the refrigerator door, and every pen in it delivered nothing at all, because saline looks exactly like insulin, and a pen is a sealed thing you have no way to test. He got sick the way a diabetic gets sick when his insulin is gone, which is not fast. It took most of a day and a night. His phone was in the kitchen, and it had been dead since 2 that afternoon, which was not an accident either, and his truck keys were not on the hook, which he never once in his life would have allowed. At some point during that night, he pulled a chair over to try to get up. And here is the part that would sit in his son's chest for the rest of his life. The coroner's own report noted that the deceased was found with his hand extended toward the doorway, and the neighbor, an 80-year-old woman named Delia Prentice with a bad hip and a good ear, told 2 different people that around 11 that night she had heard a man hollering over at Gibbs, hollering a name, and she had figured it was the television. The name was Quinton. They buried him on a Thursday, in the rain, with a folded flag for Korea-era service he had never once mentioned, and Garth Ogilvy handled the arrangements at a family discount and wept at the graveside, and Sim Vestry stood at Charmaine's elbow and carried the umbrella, and Linny stood between them in a black dress she had already outgrown at the shoulders, holding a wind-up clock in both hands because she had refused to leave it in the car. Quint was not there. The emergency leave request came back approved 4 days after the funeral, because his unit was in the middle of an operation, and a sergeant major does not get to pull the string on a target package he built. 12 time zones away, he stood in a plywood room and listened to a chaplain say the words, and then he went to his wall and worked, because that was the only thing he owned that had ever done him any good. He sent Charmaine $1,100 for the funeral and asked her, 3 times, for a copy of the death certificate. The reply came at 02:14 Ballad time. He read it standing up, and he read it about 40 times. "Stay gone, loser. Nobody wants you here. Your dad said the same thing before he died. Linny doesn't ask about you anymore. Sim is more of a father to her in 1 week than you have been in 9 years. Don't send money, don't call, and don't come home. There's nothing here that's yours." He put the phone face down on the plywood shelf. He was aware of his own heartbeat in his ears, and he was aware, with the strange clinical part of his brain that had never once turned off since 1997, that the message did not sound like his wife. Char was a slow, circling, guilty writer. This was a closer's paragraph. Somebody had told her what to send, or somebody had sent it. He wrote it down in his green notebook, verbatim, with the time. 3 nights later, at 02:07, his personal phone lit up with a number he did not know. He almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was pleasant, relaxed, a little amused, like a man calling to tell you your table was ready. "Sergeant Kirkendall, you don't know me. I've been sleeping in your bed for about a year now, and I wanted to be the one to tell you how your daddy went." Quint said nothing. He reached for the grease pencil. "He was on the floor when I got there," the voice said. "He was calling for you. He screamed your name like a kid, over and over. Quinton, Quinton." It was pitiful. A grown man crying for a boy that loads trucks in a desert. "I sent your father in the grave, and you know what? Nobody even asked a question. And I want you to sit over there in the sand and think about the fact that your little girl is next on my list. That's not a threat. That's a schedule." And then, held away from the mouthpiece, thinner, with a room's worth of air around it, a child screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, please help." The line dropped. Quinton Kirkendall stood in the dark for 11 seconds with his eyes closed. Then he opened them, and he did not scream, and he did not throw the phone, and he did not run to the operations tent. He wrote, on the butcher paper, in block capitals, the exact time. Then he wrote 3 things underneath it, and those 3 things are why Simvestry's life ended the way it did. 1. He called me on a phone he owns, in a house he thinks is his, at an hour when he had been drinking. He is proud. Pride is a seam. 2. He said 31 words about my father, and none of them were guesses. He was there. 3. The scream was not live. He had spent 9 years listening to intercept audio, and he knew the difference between a room and a recording, the way a mechanic knows an engine by ear. Linny's voice had come through with no phone line compression and no room tone behind it, and under it, faint, in the wrong place entirely, there had been a soft double chime, the brass clock on her nightstand. It struck on the half hour. His daughter had screamed at some point in her life while that clock was chiming, and Simvestry had recorded it and saved it for a night like this, which meant Linny had been frightened. It also meant she had not been frightened 3 minutes ago, in that room, on that call, which meant Quint had time. He sat down on the floor of a plywood room in Iraq at 2:10 in the morning and, in handwriting so steady it later frightened his own lawyer, began the first page of a target package on an American citizen in Ledbury County, North Carolina. By 0400 he had the frame of it, and by 0600 he had made the decision that everything else would hang from. Bex Nevins found him in the operations tent with a cup of coffee he had not touched. She had already heard, because 11 men in a compound is a village. She sat down across from him and said, quietly, "Give me the phone number. I'll have a name, an address, a vehicle, and a pattern of life in 4 hours, and nobody will ever know I looked." She meant it, and she could have done it, and for about 2 seconds, Quint wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything. He said no. He said it twice more over the next 3 days, to 2 other men who offered, and the 3rd time he explained it, because they deserved the explanation. "Everything I touch with that hand," he said, "is poison in a courtroom. If I find him with a tool I'm not allowed to have, then the day I put him in front of a jury, his lawyer stands up and says, 'Where did the sergeant major get this?' And the answer buries the case and me, and probably you. He's going to prison in front of his neighbors. Not in a ditch, in a courtroom, with the whole county watching, and every dollar he stole coming back out of him." Jonas Lockridge, his team sergeant, a lanky Alabaman who had been with him since 2001, listened to that and said, "All right, then what do you actually need?" Quint said, "I need to go home, and I need it to be legal, and I need you to hold my hand off the stove." He flew out of Balad on a Wednesday and landed at Bragg 31 hours later with a duffel and a green notebook, and he did not go to Grayling. He went to a motel off Bragg Boulevard, paid cash for 11 nights, and spent the first 2 days doing the least dramatic thing imaginable. He read public records. Deeds, liens, UCC filings, notary commissions, which in North Carolina are public and searchable and include the commission expiration date, business registrations, civil judgments, obituaries, because obituaries are the best free intelligence product in America. By the end of day 2, he had a page of names and a shape, and the shape had a hole in the middle where the money went, and he could not see into it yet. On day 3, he drove to Sardis Road. The house was locked and the locks were new. There was a lockbox on the front door of the kind realtors use. Taped inside the storm door was a notice of hearing on a special proceeding to sell real property, filed by an attorney in Ledbury on behalf of the estate, and beneath the estate's name was a line that made him stand very still. Charmaine D. Kirkendall, attorney in fact, under general power of attorney executed by Gilbert R. Kirkendall. His father had signed one too. At a folding table, in a fellowship hall, in front of a coffee urn, 6 weeks before he started noticing the mail. The barn was not locked, because his father had never locked a barn in his life, and inside the door was the slate board with the last root on it in blocky capitals, unfinished at the letter D. There was a tray under it with 3 stubs of chalk and a felt eraser worn down to the wood, and there was chalk dust on the floor in the shape of a boot. Quinton Kirkendall stood in front of his father's blackboard for a long time. Then he took the eraser, wiped a clean rectangle in the middle, and started building his wall. It stayed there for the next 4 months. That barn board is where all of it happened, and if you had walked in at any point during that autumn, you would have seen the same thing. A dead man's slate covered corner to corner, in a live man's handwriting. Names in boxes, dates on a rail, a map of Route 4 with 31 boxes marked, and next to it a running tally in 5s, and the number at the end of the tally kept growing. He was 10 minutes into it when a truck came up the drive. Sim Vestry got out and stood at the bottom of the barn ramp with his hands in his pockets and a big, open, pleasant face on him, and behind him, 100 feet back, a Ledbury County Sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop with Deputy Dixon Quimby behind the wheel and one arm out the window. Sim said, "You're not supposed to be here. Property's in probate." Quint came down the ramp and stopped 4 feet away and looked at him for a while. He was measuring, the way he had measured 200 men through a scope and a screen, and what he saw was a strong man who had never once been hit by somebody who meant it. Sim smiled and said, "No hard feelings about the phone call. I'd had a few." And then, lower, so it did not carry to the cruiser, "She really does like me better. Kid too. Ask her." "Ugh," Quint said. "Thank you." Sim's face changed a little. "What?" Quint said, "I asked you a question in my head about a minute ago, and you answered it. Thank you." Then he walked past him, past the cruiser, got in his rental, and drove to Ledbury, where he sat in the parking lot of the sheriff's office for 40 minutes to see who came and went, and at what hour, and wrote down 4 plate numbers. The question he had asked in his head was this: is he a professional, or is he a man with a good line? Professionals do not come to the scene to gloat twice. Sim Vestry had now told him more in 2 minutes than 4 days of records had. That night he called an attorney named Deborah Yardley in Fayetteville, a 60-year-old woman who had spent 30 years doing elder law and estate litigation and had a reputation for making judges sit up. He told her the whole thing in 20 minutes without adjectives. There was a pause when he finished. She said, "Sergeant Major, I want to be very clear with you. Everything you have described is one man's word. What is the paper?" He said, "My father kept a notebook." She said, "Where is it?" And that was the hole in the middle of everything, because it was not in the house, and it was not in the truck, which had been sold at auction 11 days after the funeral, and it was not in the barn, and Gib Kirkendall had told his son on a bad phone line that he had it all wrote down. It took Quint 6 more days to think like his father, instead of like himself. A rural carrier does not hide a thing. A rural carrier mails it. He drove to the post office in Ledbury and asked to see the retired clerk who had trained under his dad, a woman named Ginny Tuttle, no relation to the sheriff, who cried when she saw his face because it was his father's face. He asked her one question: if my dad wanted something to be safe and he did not trust anybody in this county, what would he have done with it? She said, "Honey, he'd have sent it to you." They found it in 11 minutes on a system that has existed, unglamorously, since the 19th century. On the 8th of the month, 3 days before he died, Gilbert Kirkendall had mailed a padded envelope to his son at an APO address in Iraq, and he had written the unit designation from memory, and the memory was 6 years old, because that had been Quint's unit in 2002. Undeliverable as addressed, insufficient address. No forwarding order on file for a unit that had not existed under that name in half a decade. which meant it had gone where all such things go. The Mail Recovery Center in Atlanta, where the Postal Service opens what it cannot deliver and tries to find a human being to give it back to. That is where Quinton Kirkendall met Postal Inspector Mireille Jarreau. She had 18 years in. She worked mail fraud and elder exploitation out of Charlotte, and she had a rule she said out loud in the first 10 minutes. I do not work for you. I do not tell you what I know, and if you go around me, I will charge you myself. And then she opened the envelope on a conference table in front of him, wearing gloves, and took out a narrow spiral notebook with a stiff green cover and a folded page torn from a legal pad, and she read the folded page first, and Quint watched her jaw set. The page said, "Son, if you are reading this, I have made a mistake somewhere. This here notebook is 31 families on Route 4 whose mail has been stopped and sent to Box 219 in Sardis. That box is rented by Homefront Family Services, S. Vestry, and the rent is paid by Ogilvy Memorial Chapel. I got that from the box rental application. Lucille let me look. 11 of these change orders were filed on days these people were not in town. I checked. The signatures on them are not right. They are all the same person's hand, and it is a woman's hand, and it is not any of theirs. Norbert Tillery has lost his farm and does not know it. Locke Ulmer's boy is in Afghanistan, and there is a second deed of trust on his mother's house he never signed. I am going to go ask about it, because I have known these people for 40 years, and there is nobody else. If it goes bad, this is what I knew, and when I knew it. You always were the smart one. Go slow. Love, Dad." Inspector Jarreau put the page down and looked at Quint for a long moment. She said, "Your father just made a federal case." Then she said, "And I need you to understand what I mean when I say I do not want your help." And Quint said, "Ma'am, I don't want to help you. I want to hand you things." That is exactly what he did for the next 11 weeks, and it is why every single thing in this story stood up in court. Because the notebook was a beginning, not an end. 31 families. 11 forged change of address orders in one woman's handwriting. And in North Carolina, every one of those forms and every one of those powers of attorney had been notarized, and a notary's stamp carries a commission number and an expiration date, and a notary is required by law to keep a journal. Quint pulled the commission records in an afternoon. 29 of the 31 had been notarized by the same person. Tammy Grimsley, 44, a clerk in the Ledbury County Register of Deeds, who had held her commission for 9 years and had never had a complaint filed against her. And here is the seam, the thing that made all of it come apart, and it is the kind of stupid, human, lazy detail that Quint had built a career on. Tammy Grimsley's commission had expired in March and been renewed in May, and her new stamp carried the new expiration date. 9 of the documents in the pile were dated in February, and every one of those 9 carried the new stamp. You cannot stamp a February document with a seal that did not exist until May unless you sat down at some point after May and stamped a stack of documents you did not witness. 9 felonies, in one woman's desk drawer, provable with a magnifying glass. Quint did not go to Tammy Grimsley. He gave it to Jarreau, and he asked her one favor, which she thought about for 2 days before she granted it. When you talk to her, let me tell you what to say first. He wrote it on the barn board like a target briefing. Not threats, never threats, just arithmetic. She is the only person in this whole thing whose name is physically on the paper. Not Vestry, not Ogilvy, hers. She is 44. She has a son at Appalachian State, and she makes $31,000 a year. She has taken maybe $9,000 total. Ogilvy has taken $2 million. When this lands, she does 8 to 11 years, and he does nothing, because his name is on nothing. Say those 2 numbers out loud and then be quiet. Do not offer her anything. Let her do the math herself. She has been doing other people's paperwork for 9 years. She will do this one. Inspector Jarreau sat across from Tammy Grimsley in an interview room in Charlotte on a Thursday morning and said about 6 sentences. Tammy Grimsley talked for 5 hours. What she gave them was the hole in the middle of the map. The money did not stay in banks. Sim Vestry would take a family's equity money and walk it, in cashier's checks, to Ogilvy Memorial Chapel, where it was deposited into irrevocable prepaid funeral trusts. 49 of them. Some were for real dead people. Some were for real live people, who had no idea they had a platinum casket paid for. 11 were for names that did not exist anywhere in the state of North Carolina. A prepaid funeral trust is nearly invisible. It is not taxed like income. It is not reported like a securities account. The trustee, in this case Garth Ogilvy, controls it, and the only time anyone ever looks at it is when somebody dies. Tammy Grimsley had notarized the paperwork on all 49 and had never once thought about what it meant that a funeral home in a county of 9,000 people was holding $2.1 million in prepaid arrangements. She gave them Rodney Dunmeyer too, and she cried when she did it, because Rodney was harmless and everybody knew it. Rodney had approved 11 equity lines on properties he had never inspected, using appraisals from a man in Sardis who had lost his license in Virginia, and Rodney's payment had been a bass boat. And she gave them Ginny Rasmussen, not because she knew what Ginny had done, because she had notarized a home health services agreement for Gilbert R. Kirkendall, dated the 2nd of the month, 9 days before he died, that Gib had never signed, and she remembered it because Sim had brought it in on a Sunday and had been in a hurry, and Sim was never in a hurry. That was the thread that pulled the murder out. Inspector Jarrow and an FBI agent out of Charlotte took Ginny Rasmussen in her driveway on a Tuesday morning. She lasted 11 minutes. She said she had swapped the insulin. She said Sim told her the old man had a heart thing anyway, and it would just make him sleep and be confused so they could get a doctor to say he wasn't competent. She said she believed that, and maybe on some floor of herself she had. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of the case, and she said it looking at the table. He went back that night. He said he wanted to make sure the old man didn't call anybody, and he had his phone out when he came back to the car. Jarrow said, his phone. She said, he showed me. He was laughing. They found it 11 days later on a laptop in a safe in the storefront on Grayling's Main Street. In a folder Sim Vestry had labeled with a single letter. 4 minutes and 9 seconds of video, shot vertically, of a 71-year-old retired mail carrier on his kitchen floor, and a man's voice off camera saying, say his name again. Say it again, old man. Quinton Kirkendall was never allowed to watch that video, and he never asked to. He knew what was on it from the transcript, and he read the transcript once, in Deborah Yardley's office with the door shut, and then he went out to his rental car and sat in it for 2 hours. That was the night he made the second decision that everything hangs from, because he had, by then, a complete picture of a man. He knew Sim Vestry drove a gray truck and a white Charger. He knew the storefront's alarm code because Char had told Linny, and Linny had told him on the phone without knowing what she was saying. He knew there was a hunting cabin on Marrowbone Creek that belonged to Sim's ex-wife's family in Tennessee, a place Sim had gone twice for weeks at a time. He knew where the man ate breakfast. He had, in a green notebook, everything a person would need to make Sim Vestry stop existing on a Tuesday. And he wrote, on the barn board, in chalk, the sentence that his lawyer would later say was the smartest thing any client of hers had ever done. If I kill him, I am the story. If I take his money, his protection, and his name, and hand him to the government breathing, he is the story, and it never ends for him. So he went after the money. Here is what he did, and it is the part of this story I think about the most, because it is not violence and it is better than violence. Garth Ogilvy had one weakness, and it was not greed. It was that he had never in his life had a partner he could not replace. Every man in that operation was disposable to him, and he assumed, correctly, that they knew it, which meant he lived with a permanent low hum of suspicion that any one of them would sell him. A man like that does not need to be lied to. He needs to be shown a true thing at the right moment, from a direction he trusts. Quint had that direction. Tammy Grimsley was now cooperating, and Garth Ogilvy did not know it. And Garth Ogilvy had trusted Tammy's paperwork for 9 years. So over 11 days, with Jarrow's knowledge and a federal prosecutor named Fiona Ledbury signing off on every step, Tammy Grimsley did 4 small, true, ordinary things. She mentioned to Ogilvy's office manager that Sim had asked her, months back, what it would take to change a trustee on a prepaid trust. She sent Ogilvy, by mistake, a copy of a document she had actually notarized in July, in which Sim Vestry had added his own name as a signatory on 2 of the funeral trusts. That was real. Sim had done it, quietly, greedily, the way that kind of man always does. She let it slip that a federal inspector had been in the Register of Deeds pulling notary records, which was true, and that she had heard Sim's name, which was true. And then she went silent for 4 days and did not return calls, which is the loudest thing a frightened accomplice can do. Garth Ogilvy did exactly what Quint had drawn on a blackboard that he would do. On a Friday afternoon, he moved every dollar he could reach out of the trusts Sim had touched, closed the storefront's account, called in a lawyer, and told Ossian Grimsley, Tammy's 49-year-old brother, a man who had done 4 years at Craggy for aggravated assault and who worked as Ogilvy's driver and did his unpleasant errands, that Sim Vestry had been stealing from the trusts and talking to the feds. Sim Vestry woke up on a Saturday morning to find that he had no money, no protection, and a man he was afraid of looking for him. That is when he stopped being a salesman and became what he actually was, which was a cornered animal with a girl in the house. On Sunday the 11th, at 6:40 in the evening, Sim Vestry put Linnea Kirkendall in the gray truck and drove out of Grayling. Charmaine let it happen. That is the flat, ugly fact of it, and it is the fact she pled to. He told her the feds were coming, that they were going to take the house and take Linny into custody, that he had a friend with a place in Tennessee where they could sit still for a week until his lawyer sorted it out, and that she should follow in the morning with the cash. She stood in her own kitchen and watched a man she had known for 4 years put her 9-year-old in a truck, and she went inside and packed a bag. She called Quint at 9:15 that night. It was the first time she had called him in 14 months. Quint was in the motel in Fayetteville. He wrote down what she said, and the times, and then he asked her 4 questions in a voice she later described on the stand as the calmest voice she had ever heard in her life, and she said it made her more afraid than any yelling would have. What was he wearing? What did he take? Did he fill up, and where? Did he take her clock? She said, her what? He said, the little brass clock by her bed. Is it there? She went and looked. It was gone. Linny had taken it. A 9-year-old, being walked out to a truck by a man who scared her, had grabbed the one thing that belonged to her grandfather. He called Inspector Jarrow, then the Ledbury Sheriff, then the FBI, in that order, and every one of them started doing the correct, lawful, slow things that agencies do, and Quint let them, because he wanted the record to show he had. An Amber Alert went out at 11:52 p.m. Then he drove. Not toward Tennessee, to a sit-go on Route 9 outside Sardis, because in his father's notebook there was a note about Box 219, and a receipt, and because Char had said Sim always fueled at the same place, and because Sim Vestry was a creature of habit who had never once been hunted. The clerk remembered the truck. 14 minutes of security video showed Sim at Pump 3 at 7:11 p.m., and it showed a 9-year-old girl in the passenger seat, alive, upright, with a small brass object in her hands. It also showed something that took Quint about 4 seconds to see, and would have taken a normal person 4 hours. The truck was riding low in the back, and there was a black plastic fuel caddy strapped in the bed. A man running to a cabin does not carry 60 gallons of spare fuel. A man carries spare fuel when he intends not to stop at stations, because stations have cameras, which meant he was not going to Tennessee, or not only, and it meant he had planned this before Sunday. Quint stood in a gas station parking lot at 1 in the morning and did the same arithmetic he had done on 100 nights over 100 maps. Fuel range, time, which direction has the fewest cameras and the most gravel. Then he called Jonas Lockridge, who was on mid-tour leave in Alabama, and said 11 words, and Jonas got in a truck. They did not find her by kicking a door. They found her by doing what Gib Kirkendall had taught a boy in the right seat of a mail jeep. They noticed the thing that had stopped. The cabin on Marrowbone Creek was watched by the FBI by Monday noon, and it was empty, and it stayed empty. Everybody sat on it. Quint left it alone entirely. Instead, he took the ex-wife's family name and pulled property records in 3 counties, the way he had done on day 1, and found that the same family had owned a second parcel since 1978, 40 acres with no structure on it and a road frontage of 11 feet, and the tax bill on it had been paid every year by hand, at the counter, in cash. And then he checked the one thing nobody else thought to check, because it was his father's whole religion. He checked the mail. There was a rural box at the end of that 11-foot frontage, and it was not on any active delivery list, and Quint drove past it at 5:40 on Monday evening at 40 miles an hour without slowing down. The flag was up. Somebody had put outgoing mail in a box on a road nobody lived on. He did not stop. He drove 11 miles, called Jero, and told her. And 40 minutes later, a deputy who did not know why he was doing it drove out and pulled a single envelope from the box. It was addressed to a bail bondsman in Knoxville. It had been written that day. The FBI hit the property at 4:11 Tuesday morning. There was a travel trailer under camouflage netting 800 yards back in the pines. Linnea Kirkendall was in it, dehydrated, sunburned, unhurt, and asleep with a brass wind-up clock under her arm. She had wound it every night. Sim Vestry was not there. He had left the trailer at midnight in a truck with 60 gallons of spare fuel, because he had one thing left to do before he ran, and it was the same thing every cornered man does. He went for his money. Ogilvy Memorial Chapel sat on a corner lot in Grayling with a white portico and a magnolia, and in the basement, in a room with a dehumidifier and a wall of file cabinets, Garth Ogilvy kept the trust ledgers on paper, because he was 63 and did not trust computers, and because paper had never once been subpoenaed out of that basement in 3 generations. Sim Vestry knew that room. He had carried checks down those stairs 11 dozen times. He came in through the side door at 4:50 on Tuesday morning with a knife in his belt and a duffel bag, and he found that the federal government had been in the basement since Monday afternoon with a search warrant signed by a magistrate in Raleigh, that the cabinets were empty, that Garth Ogilvy had been arrested at his home at 6 p.m. the day before, and that Ossian Grimsley was sitting in the dark at the bottom of the stairs with a tire iron across his knees, waiting for the man he had been told had sold them all. What happened in that basement took about 90 seconds, and neither man has ever told it the same way twice. Grimsley came out of the stairwell with a broken jaw and a knife wound in his forearm, and Sim Vestry came out of the side door bleeding from the scalp, at a dead run, into a parking lot. Quinton Kirkendall was standing in it. He had been there since 3 in the morning. He had told Inspector Jero he would be there, in writing, in an email, time-stamped, because he had spent 4 months making sure that every single thing he did could be read out loud in a courtroom without costing him a night's sleep. The FBI had told him to stay in his vehicle. 2 agents were coming around the building at that moment. There is dashcam video of all of it, which is why we know exactly what was said. Sim Vestry stopped 11 feet away with a knife in his hand and blood in his eyes, and screamed at him, "You did this, you, a man that loads trucks." And Quint said, one time, flatly, "Put it down. Federal agents are behind you." Sim came at him. It lasted about 4 seconds. Quint stepped inside the arc of it the way a man does when he has done that particular thing several thousand times with people who were much better at it, took the wrist, took the elbow, and put Sim Vestry face down on wet asphalt with his arm ruined in 2 places and a knee across his shoulder blades, and he did not hit him once after the man was down, and the agents were on them 9 seconds later, and every second of that is on video, and it is why a jury later heard the words "justified" and did not have to think about them very long. While they cuffed him, with his face against the parking lot of the funeral home that had held his money, Sim Vestry said, "What are you?" And Quint leaned down and said the only sentence he ever said to him that was not an order. "I'm the guy who found people for a living. You called me and told me who you were." The case went to trial 14 months later in federal court in Raleigh, and it took 9 weeks. And it was, as Deborah Yardley had promised, a slaughter, because it was made almost entirely of paper. 31 forged change of address orders, 9 notarized documents stamped with a seal that did not exist on the date they were signed, 49 funeral trusts holding $2.1 million stolen from 44 families, 38 of them military families, in an 11-year conspiracy. 11 equity lines approved by a loan officer whose payment was a bass boat, a home health aide's confession, a 4-minute video, and a narrow green spiral notebook, entered as Government Exhibit 1, which the prosecutor Fiona Ledbury held up in her opening statement and did not let go of for 6 minutes. She said, this case was not built by the FBI. It was built by a 71-year-old rural letter carrier with a pen, who noticed that 31 of his neighbors had stopped getting their mail, and who wrote down what he saw because nobody else would. He mailed it to his son. He got the address wrong by 6 years. The Postal Service opened it in Atlanta, and that is the only reason we are all in this room. They played the phone call for the jury. Sim Vestry had called from his own cell phone, drunk, at 2:07 in the morning, and the recording came off the carrier's system, and it was played twice, and on the second pass a forensic audio examiner testified that the child's scream in the background was a playback of a recording, identifiable by the absence of room reverberation and by a clock chime that occurred, on the file, 11 seconds out of phase with real time. The jury was out for 5 hours. Simeon Vestry, whose real name turned out to be Grady Crowder, and who had run a version of the same operation in 2 Ohio counties from 1996 to 2001 under a different name, was convicted on 41 federal counts, and then, in state court 8 months later, of first-degree murder in the death of Gilbert R. Kirkendall. He is serving life without parole. He is 51 now. He has filed 11 appeals and lost all of them, and he will spend somewhere near 4 decades thinking about a 2-minute phone call he made because he could not stand not being admired for what he had done. Garth Ogilvy took a plea at 81 months and died of a stroke in his 3rd year inside. Ossian Grimsley got 60 months. Ginny Rasmussen got 22 years for second-degree murder and cooperated all the way down. Rodney Dunmeyer got 37 months and lost the boat. Deputy Dixon Quimby, who had been paid $400 a month to lose paperwork, was fired, charged, and pled to obstruction. Tammy Grimsley served 11 months, testified in every proceeding, and now works, of all things, at a nonprofit in Greensboro that helps elderly people unwind fraudulent deeds. Charmaine Kirkendall pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and to felony child abuse by allowing her daughter to be taken. She served 5 years. She wrote her daughter a letter every week of it, and Quint did not withhold a single one, and did not read one, and told Linny the same thing every time. That's yours. You decide. He got full custody 11 weeks after the arrest. He put in his retirement papers at 20 years and took a job teaching at a schoolhouse 90 minutes from Grayling, and he came home every night at 4:30 for 9 straight years. And if you want to know what that was worth to him, you should know that he kept a tally of it in chalk on the barn door, in 5s, like his father's numbers, and he never once erased it. The 81 acres came back. It took 2 years and a special proceeding to void the powers of attorney and unwind the deeds, and 44 families got restitution out of the trusts, and 11 of them got their farms back, and Norbert Tillery, who was 86 by then, got to die in his own house, which he did, 4 years later, in his own bed, with his mail piled on the kitchen table. The list of names in Gib Kirkendall's notebook is on a wall in a training room at a postal inspection office in Charlotte. They use it to teach new inspectors what a pattern looks like. And the barn board is still there. Quint sanded the frame and put a piece of glass over it, and under the glass is his father's last route, unfinished, in blocky capitals, stopped at the letter D. Hey, it's Nathan again. I want to leave you with the 2 things in this story that I cannot stop turning over. The first is the paperwork. I know that is not the exciting part. But everything that happened to that family happened because of 1 page signed at a folding table under a flag, with a coffee urn going, by people who were scared and busy and wanted to believe that the nice man was nice. A general power of attorney is not a favor. It is a loaded weapon with your name engraved on it. If you are deploying, if you are getting old, if you are helping your parents, use a limited power of attorney that says exactly what the person may do and exactly when it expires. Get it from a real attorney or a legal assistance office, and never ever let the person who benefits from the paperwork be the person who explains the paperwork to you. And watch the mail. When statements stop arriving, that is not a relief. That is an alarm. Fraud does not start with money moving. It starts with information stopping. The second thing is about revenge, and it is the reason I picked this story. Quinton Kirkendall had every skill required to make Sim Vestry disappear, and he had the moral permission of about 99% of the people listening to this. He said no, not because he was gentle, because he understood something most angry people never figure out. Killing a man ends his consequences. It hands him a quiet exit and hands you his sentence. What actually destroyed Sim Vestry was slower and much worse. He lost his money, then his protection, then his name, then the version of himself he liked. He is alive right now, in a cell, aged and forgotten, in a story where he is not the clever one. He got to watch a dead mailman beat him with a notebook. There is an old idea in the kind of work Quint did that I think civilians should steal. Do not attack the enemy where he is strong. Attack where he is careless. Vestry was strong at charm, at intimidation, at reading frightened people. He was careless about paper, because paper had never hurt him before, and he was careless about pride, because he had never met anybody who would let him talk. So if somebody has taken something from you, and you are lying awake building the loud version in your head, I would just ask you to consider the quiet one. Write it down, get the dates, keep the envelopes, find the seam. Be boring, be patient, and be the person in the room who is still taking notes when everybody else has started yelling. Old Gib Kirkendall said it best, out the window of a mail jeep, to a boy who would spend his whole life proving it. Anybody can see a thing. The trick is noticing when a thing stops. Thanks for listening. Take care of your people.